So when it comes to negative film, or in this case, color negative film, you often hear people talk about the importance of exposing for the shadows or even rating the film at a lower box speed. And this is usually done as a way to overexpose the film on purpose, so you can avoid some of the things that come with underexposure, like excess grain or muddy shadows. So that being said, I think it's super important to test out different film stocks and really gain an understanding of how they deal with different exposure scenarios. So today we're going to take the Pentax 672, we're going to load up a roll of Kodak's Portra 400, and we're going to run it through a bunch of different under and overexposure tests and take a look at the results. So today we're going to be shooting here at this abandoned commercial complex that I found here in Florida. I figure it's going to work pretty nice just because we have the one side that's lit by the sun, and then we have the other side which is still in shadow, and then we have a little bit of foreground and then blue sky above just to add some color. On the Pentax 672, you get 10 frames out of a roll of 120. So what we're gonna do is we are going to shoot the first frame at the correct exposure, and then the next 3 frames are gonna be -1, -2, -3, and then we're gonna do the following 6 frames all the way from +1 to +6. It should give us a pretty good idea of the film's limitations. For anyone new to film, an important thing to understand is that regardless of how over or underexposed your film is, the lab you use is always going to try and make the scanned image look as normal as possible during the scanning process. The way you expose affects the density of your film negative, which has an impact on the final look of the scan. So I just finished metering the scene, and the exposure I'm going to roll with as the first and as the correct exposure is 1/250th at f/16. For the next one, we'll do 1 stop underexposed, which is going to be a 500th. Then we're going to go to 1/1000. For the third underexposed shot, we're going to go to f/22. We're going to go back to f/16, 1/125th. First stop overexposed. 60th is going to be 2 stops over. 30th. 15th, and 8th is going to be our 5 stops, and then a 4th is going to be our last one, 6 stops over. So I just got scans back from the lab, and I've spent a little bit of time going over these. The negatives were scanned on an Aritsu scanner with lower contrast preference. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna take a look at these, and then I'm gonna share my opinion based on the results and how it would affect me moving forward. I have included a download link in the information below, so by all means go ahead and download the files and take a look at the high-res samples to see for yourself. So starting out, we got the normal exposure. All good here, obviously. Let's start working backwards. Here's the -1 exposure, and you know, already at 1 stop of underexposure, I'm starting to see some differences. Subtle, but they're definitely there. It seems the shadows have got a bit muddy, but there really isn't that much of a difference in color. I think worst case, you could get away with 1 stop of underexposure, but it's definitely interesting to see that it's affecting the image already. So at 2 stops of underexposure, the difference is definitely starting to become very apparent. I mean, the shadows in the midtones are becoming very muddy. And for me personally, I wouldn't move forward with an image like this unless it was my intention from the start to achieve a look like this. 3 stops, not much saving this one. Very, very washed out, and starting to see a lot more grain in the image. So let's go up now to 1 stop overexposed. So really, not much difference here compared to the normal. All that I'm seeing is a slight bump in contrast and saturation over the normal exposure, but not really enough that it's altering the image drastically. 2 stops, very similar result to the last image. Small bump in contrast and saturation, but again, nothing altering the image in a major way at all. 3 stops, very impressed still. I mean, not really that much difference between the previous 2 images at all. It's pretty cool to see. So it seems like at 4 stops, we're finally starting to see a bit of color shift here. The blue sky seems like it's shifting away from magenta and to kind of a more teal bias, as well as the highlights picking up a bit of a teal cast and becoming a bit less brilliant. So 5 stops, and now we're really starting to see that teal cast come over the whole image. And it seems like we're starting to see a little bit of a drop in contrast as well. And at 6 stops, that teal cast is very heavy and the contrast is getting lower. The image is starting to become a lot more flat. I think 5 stops overexposed, in a worst case scenario, the image could still be considered usable. For me, at 6 stops, I think things are just starting to shift way too much. So everyone's probably going to have their own opinions on what they consider acceptable or not. I'd be very comfortable using any one of the images from 1 stop to 3 stops overexposed. 4 stops overexposed, I would definitely use in a worst case scenario. But at 5 and 6 stops overexposed, things are just starting to shift a little bit too much for my taste. But with that being said, 3 stops is a pretty big change in exposure. I mean, we're talking going from 1/500th of a second to 1/60th of a second. And really, I can't see too many scenarios where your camera's internal meter or your handheld meter are going to be off by that much. I think a really good place to start is by simply just rating your film at a lower box speed, just to make sure that you're avoiding any underexposure at all. Overall, this test was very interesting. In future episodes, we're going to take a look at Kodak's Ektar 100 as well as Fuji's 400H and see how they respond to different lighting scenarios.